Well, I didn't. I just accepted the orthodoxy for most of my life, and I'd say maybe 15 years ago, I read there was a new book out that was called The Unspeakable by a guy called James Douglas, and there's 100 books about my uncle's assassination, and a lot of them, most of them are filled with really good information. Some of them, not so much. But this book distilled all of the million pages of materials and the confessions, et cetera, and the evidence that had been released since 1964, since the Warren Commission report in 1964. And for people who don't know it, after my uncle was killed, President Johnson appointed a commission to pin his death on Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald, we now know, was a CIA asset. He was recruited by the CIA, I think, in 1958, and he was at that time a Marine radar pilot at the Atasui Air Force Base in Japan. And then he did a fake defection to the Soviet Union, and then he was brought, after that defection, he was brought to Dallas. And but there's so much. But the Warren Commission report didn't know that. The Warren Commission didn't know that Lee Harvey Oswald worked for the CIA. And the head of the Warren Commission was the CIA director, former director, Alan Dulles, who my uncle had fired. Mm-hmm. So why would you put that guy at the CIA was a suspect? Why would you put him as head of it? He clearly inculcated himself into that position. And they came out with a report that said that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman. Well, 10 years later, in 1973, Congress reopened the investigation, and Congress came back and said, and they were looking at a lot more documents, and they came back and said, no, it was a conspiracy. So that was the official finding of Congress, and that committee pointed to the CIA and to the mob. And what they didn't know was the close relationship between the CIA and the mob, that there was really no daylight. And then since that report, there's been a million more documents released that, where we now know what happened and who did it almost to a certitude. And and the guy who distilled all of that information in the most readable, really, it's a riveting book, was a guy called James Douglas, and the book was The Unspeakable. And I read that book, and then I showed it to Ted Sorensen, who was my uncle's speechwriter, and both of us were transformed by it. And then I started, doing more research, talking to people who were involved. I went to talk to one of the people who had met with Lee Harvey Oswald, who was another CIA assassin, a Cuban from Miami, and I did a lot of firsthand research, but I always thought my father's murder was by Sirhan. And Sirhan confessed to the murder. There was 77 eyewitnesses, and it never occurred to me that that may not have been, that anybody else was involved. And Paul Schrade, the person who was shot that night with my father, basically forced me to come to his house in Pasadena and look at the autopsy reports about my father. And after I read those autopsy reports, it became clear that the shots that killed my father did not come from Sirhan's gun. Sirhan fired, and I've been to meet with Sirhan and again.
You've talked to him?
Yeah, I talked to him, and I spent a couple of hours with him in prison. And then,
for what though? Because I've lost a brother to somebody who murdered him. I don't know that I would have the strength or courage, or not even courage. I don't even know if I'd be able to contain myself. What was the intention? Did you need closure? Did you want?
No, I just wanted justice. My father was the head chief law enforcement official in the country, and he was, a very, very strong advocate for prison reform. And, here was a guy who's been in jail for almost 60 years, and he's 77 years old. And he's a little tiny, kind of, harmless guy, and then I realized that he had not, although he had fired a gun at my father, his bullets had not killed my father. So I'll just tell you this briefly. This is what the autopsy report shows. Sirhan was waiting for my father at a steam table in the kitchen. My father was not supposed to go through the kitchen, but he was led through the kitchen and led directly into that ambush. Sirhan fired 2 shots at him. The first of those shots hit Paul Schrade in the head, who was standing beside my father. The second shot missed my father and went and hit a door jamb behind my father, and it was later removed by the LAPD. Then Sirhan was grabbed by 6 people, including Rayford Johnson, who was one of my father's best friends. He was the 1960 decathlon champion at the Olympic, and he was godfather to my brother. He grabbed him. Rosie Greer, who was part of the fearsome foursome, the Oakland Raiders, and he had been a bodyguard for my father, but one of his best friends. And then 4 other guys, and they grabbed Sirhan and they pinned him on the back of the steam table. They took his gun and pointed it away from my father in the opposite direction. And I've talked to Rayford Johnson about this, and he said, because Rayford Johnson's a huge man, he's like 6'4", solid muscle, even into his 70s. And Sirhan is this little tiny guy, and Rayford said, I tried to get the gun away from him, but he had like superhuman strength, and he fired the gun 4 more times, and he emptied, or 6 more times, and he emptied the magazine. Well, all of those bullets hit people. So we know what happened to every single bullet. And Sirhan was always 5 or 6 feet in front of my father. My father never turned his back on him. The bullets that killed my father were 4 bullets, and they were all fired from behind. The autopsy report said they were all contact shots. In other words, the barrel of the gun was touching his body when the trigger was pulled. So while everybody was looking at Sirhan firing these shots, the shots that killed my father were actually coming from behind. And the person who almost certainly fired those shots was a guy called Eugene Thanes Cesar, who was a security guard who had grabbed my father's elbow and led him into the kitchen, into the ambush. And he was holding my father by the elbow with his left hand, and while Sirhan was firing. And he had his gun drawn, which there were eyewitnesses and he never denied. He told the police, I drew my gun to fire at Sirhan, but nobody ever saw that. And my father, when he fell, must have known that he was being shot from behind, because the last thing he did is turn and he tore off Cesar's clip-on tie. So if you see the early pictures of my father, my mother took that away and put a rosary in his hand. But the earliest pictures of him lying on the ground, he's holding a clip-on tie, and there's pictures of Cesar with no clip-on tie. He was a security guard. And that was part of his uniform. He had gotten that job 2 days before. And after it was known that my father was going to speak at the Ambassador Hotel, and he was working for a company called A Security Company, but his full-time job was at a top-secret classified job at the Lockheed Defense Plant. And before that, he had worked for Hughes Aircraft, and Hughes was involved with a lot of the mobsters who were involved in the original Kennedy, my uncle's assassination.
So given all that history, you're talking about mobsters, CIA, FBI, people are watching right now saying, why would you run for president knowing that they're not going to give you the protection, knowing what all your families had to sacrifice, what you personally have had to sacrifice? Why would you run given all that?
Well, I mean, look, I lost 2 uncles during World War II. My other uncle, President Kennedy, was MIA for 10 days and presumed dead. his ship was cut in two in the Malacca Straits in a fog by a Japanese destroyer, and some of his crew was killed, and he was then swam to an island dragging a man with a lanyard in his teeth who was badly burned. And my father joined the minute that he could to go to fight in World War II. And I was raised the idea that if you care about your democracy, that you have to make sacrifices for it. And that, during World War II, during all these wars, we lost a million Americans who were willing to put their lives on the line for our country. In 1776, we lost 25,000 Americans who gave their lives to give us the Constitution. And, Thomas Jefferson said that the tree of liberty has to be watered with the blood of every generation. And what he meant by that is in every generation, we need people who are willing to stand up and fight for our country, or we're going to lose it. And so for me, the physical danger is not something I ever think about. It's not something I consider. I only think about, is this something that I should be doing? And if I should, then the rest I leave in God's hands. And, I try to live my life that way, to make the effort to do keep doing the next right thing. And then the results belong to God. And, that they're completely out of my control. But I'm supposed to wake up every morning and say, reporting for duty, sir. And then, try to live my life by making moral choices. And I believe that I was in a unique position to remind people about what this country is supposed to look like, what its ideals are, to unravel the warfare state, to unravel this corrupt merger of state and corporate power that's taken over, that has hijacked our government away from the people, to end the toxic divisions that keep us apart, so that these corporate cartels can funnel money upwards and strip mine the wealth from the American middle class, and to end the addiction to war, to end the chronic disease epidemic, which nobody's talking about, which is the biggest killer, the biggest issue in our country today. That our kids are all sick from autoimmune disease and food allergies and asthma and allergic diseases. When I was a kid, my uncle was president. 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, 60% do. And, the black community is the sickest community in our country, and that and American Indians. And, nobody's asking the question about where did this diabetes epidemic come from?